David, this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, Actual Evolutionary Psychology by Actual Evolutionary Psychologists. You're David Pinsoff. I'm Dave Pietrzewski. Do you have anything to say?
Wow, you got it all by yourself. I didn't even need to help you in any way.
All right, well, you can do the next part.
All right, enjoy listening.
Okay, so today,
We have a very special guest, the amazing Clark Barrett, professor of anthropology at UCLA. I interacted a lot with him while I was at UCLA. He was on my dissertation committee. Wonderful, brilliant thinker, really insightful guy. I think he's perhaps the best at integrating and merging different perspectives within the evolutionary behavioral sciences. His book, How Mental Adaptations, The Shape of Thought, How Mental Adaptations Evolve, is a wonderful text in terms of integrating evolutionary psychology with cultural evolution, with human behavioral ecology, showing how we're all studying the same thing and we can all just get along.
yeah,
Um,
Clark is sort of, in my view, is sort of the second wave ev psych person, one of the main second wave ev psych people in the sense of after the initial generation of psych people to just sort of say, look, here is what the mature science looks like. Here's the boundaries of it. And let's avoid the unnecessary arguments and baggage. And let's do what can we do generatively going forward? And I think this conversation is a good example of Clark's philosophy of respecting the insights of lots of different diverse viewpoints and then steel manning them, as you put it in this episode.
Yes, and we cover a lot of really interesting topics, spirituality, social cognition. We get into ayahuasca, we get into ghost murders,
Drugs and
uh,
rock and roll,
drugs and
and
rock and roll,
yeah.
you name it, and just the future of evolutionary social science, and how we can create a bigger tent and be more welcoming to lots of different people and lots of different cultures. This was a wonderful, just wide-ranging conversation with a really great thinker, and I think
Yeah,
you'll enjoy it.
and fish with two jaws, which
Yeah, we even get into fish. Yeah, he was a fish guy. You'll hear all about that soon. So enjoy.
so we can just get right into it. Clark, you don't have to answer this, but one thing I don't know about you, or maybe the beginning of the story is you are a younger Clark Barrett is on a boat studying fish.
Hmm.
Can you paint us that picture and how did you get there and how did you get to where you are now from there?
Yeah. Well, I can't guarantee that that ever happened, but
Okay.
I do have some memories to that effect.
Okay.
Um,
It might have been implanted in you. Yeah. But you did, you
yeah.
studied like fish, right?
Yes. My early dream was to be a marine biologist,
Hmm.
influenced by childhood viewings of Jacques Cousteau and also, my dad had a business, boat business, and we were on boats a lot, and including in the Caribbean. And so there I learned how to snorkel and then later scuba dive. When I was in an undergraduate, I actually was a bio major and I did an honors thesis at Harvard on reproductive seasonality in rainforest stream fish, and which would not technically be marine biology because those are freshwater fish. But yeah, I was a fish guy. And then I started grad school at UCSB um, for a year or two working in the bio department and um, hadn't really selected a project or anything like that, but I did go and help some of the other graduate students who were doing their research down in St. Croix. And at that point, I realized that humans might be my thing more than fish, even though studying and learning about fish definitely informed um, lots of what I do, including the fish behavior stuff, but also my undergrad mentor at Harvard was Carl Lehm, who's a functional morphologist,
Hmm.
and his claim to fame was trying to understand why cichlid fish have two jaws, an inner and an outer jaw. And that played a role in their diversification. I don't know if you know that cichlids are one of the most diverse family of freshwater fish, and because they can specialize their inner and outer jaws separately, there's many niches that they can occupy. So it kind of pre-adapts them for diversification or adaptive radiation. That was his hypothesis anyway. So,
That's cool.
there was a
Sort of like
connection there with
mm,
functional morphology, which then, thinking about adaptationism in the context of evolutionary psychology, I feel like I was already kind of ready to
mm,
start thinking about that.
sort of like a Swiss Army jaw. It can sort of
Yes.
be, that's cool.
Yes.
Well,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, presumably there would have to be neural circuitry as well designed to, contort the jaw in whatever shape is ecologically
Mhm.
advantageous. So there would have to be a mental adaptation in addition to a
Yes.
jaw muscular adaptation.
Yes. And it's kind of interesting to think about what the phenomenology of these fish is when they're controlling their inner and outer jaw separately and you know
Cool.
they also, they're one of the fish that are mouth. They breed they protect their young inside their mouth.
Oh, cool.
Mm.
So the
Interesting.
babies hatch out of the eggs, and then I mean, sometimes you can see this in aquarium stores. They'll all like run into the mother's mouth when it's danger time, and so there's also got to be a lot of circuitry there to decide, when to start chewing or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
avoid swimming into the wrong mouth.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah. So
baby
super
design
interesting.
can't be swim into the nearest fish's mouth when you
Right.
get
Mhm.
feel danger. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a dead end.
Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting. And then from there, so you decided people.
Yes. Yeah, and I had always been interested in also as an undergraduate, I really wanted to double major in biology and philosophy because I was always interested in philosophy of mind, interested in questions about consciousness and free will. And I think, early on I had a strong intuition that evolution could tell us about some of those things. But as an undergraduate it wasn't really feasible to double major in those things and do an honors thesis that would encompass both. And so I really doubled down on the biology side. And I think when I got to graduate school and started getting a sense of what is possible in a PhD, I realized that there was a more open set of possibilities than, what you can study as an undergrad, at least at that time. And so, yeah, that's when I switched over within UCSB to work with Tubi and Cosmides.
How did you
Mm.
find them?
The phone book.
Okay. So
So
paint a
actually,
picture for the kids
I mean,
listening
did you know
who are
that
like, is that
evol
like Facebook? Like, what is the phone book? Like,
no, this is the strange thing. It
okay.
was it was it was some sort of reverse landing
Yeah.
where I did not know what evolutionary psychology was at that time, at least to the best of my recollection. Um, I was familiar with that there were evolutionary approaches to human behavior, including E.O. Wilson and Stephen Jay Gould and others that I interacted with at Harvard. So I was familiar with that, but I just didn't know. I didn't know John and Lita, and I didn't know that they were at UCSB. And I just started looking around. This was 1991,
Yeah. It's the early days of John and Lita. Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
92,
Yeah.
something like that. So there wasn't, the same kind of, was there even an internet then? I can't remember.
I mean,
But
what luck? That's
Maybe
a
you couldn't Google, you
enormous
couldn't
luck.
Google
DARPA. Yeah,
people,
exactly.
so it's like, yeah, I'm looking in the directory of these different departments for the faculty and what their specializations are. And yeah, and I actually called John's landline,
Did he
which was
pick up?
no, it was
Okay.
in his lab and one of the students picked up. But
Yeah.
eventually I ended up meeting with them and yeah, moved over to start working with them in the anthro department.
You just happened to be at the epicenter of evolutionary psychology right at the moment that it was being born.
Yes.
Yeah,
Like I
that's
said, that's my personal mythology. Whether I'm
yeah.
remembering it wrong, I
Yeah,
don't know. But
exactly.
I'm pretty sure that's how it happened. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I love your dissertation work is on predator prey stuff. And
Yes.
I think because you've done so many wonderful things since then, But at least for me, there's a very special place in my heart for the predator prey work. You
Mm.
don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. Like I know everybody feels differently about their dissertation work, but um, was that um, part of your figuring out how to take an evolutionary approach to people? Like, was that addressing the interest that you had? Like, how did you get on that topic?
Yeah, I mean it did end up going in that direction. So it was a way to, it was a way to unify my background and knowledge in biology and ecology um, with an interest in how we humans think about the mind. And so the idea was to kind of look at how what kinds of models, if you will, people have of animal minds and animal behavior. And it was, you know,
Hmm.
honestly, a lot of it was John Tooby's idea. Both John and Lita, they kind of pushed me to that. When I came, I was, I mentioned that I had this interest in free will and consciousness, and um, I wanted to go straight for the jugular on that, and they did the right thing as advisors and said that's too big of a bite
Yeah.
to attempt for a PhD, and so go for something more tractable, and so I ended up doing the predator prey stuff and turned it into something that actually did steer towards this direction of like models of the mind, how we think about free will and consciousness and agency, I guess is the better concept there. And I still am interested in this idea of, you I think part of the key, Dave, I know you've done some stuff also on free will and that topic, and I think one of the sources of evidence about it that we should attend to is how and why people think about free will. When we attribute choice to others, when do we do that? Why do we do that? Um, and I'm actually in the camp that thinks, yes, we may be mistaken sometimes, but human social cognition is so good that I think that when people make a distinction between, voluntarily chosen action and something else, they're onto something.
Hmm.
And I do think that there are mysteries there, but to me, that's an angle that we should pursue more, and I think hasn't been pursued as much because people in neuroscience and psychology, when they look at these questions, they tend to think of it more like, let's get inside the box and see what's in there, as opposed to why do humans attribute these kinds of properties and processes to other organisms, and when and what use does it do to them, for them, and so on. And that kind of led to my interest in moral cognition and this question
Mhm.
of, culpability, which can be closely linked to our models of, how much control we have over our own behavior and things like that.
Cool. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
and you've done cross-cultural work, so on sort of like intention and things like that. And that's another thing we can maybe talk
Yeah.
about. But what I'm hearing you say is that the one mistake or a difference between evolutionary approaches and non, or at least the kind that you're doing, is is sort of taking a step back and saying, why would an organism think this way, or what's the sense that it would make? But that also sort of assumes that our introspection about it isn't the end all and be all, which I think you get from an evolutionary approach.
Right. I agree with that totally. Yeah. And and we do, psychologists, anthropologists, evolutionary psychologists, we do understand broadly that, you know, people are some of the best source of evidence about, I mean, if we're, we get data from how people think about things, right? Um, but maybe it's not so common to take those data as actually telling you a little bit about the things that they're about, the targets of of that cognition. I mean, to me, I think in so when we look at, say, intuitive physics, to take an example that people talk about, like nobody would really, well, maybe they would, but it seems unlikely that somebody would study the actual ontological reality of the physical world by looking at how people think about it, although I guess maybe,
Okay, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it's different in a domain like morality or the
Yeah.
understanding of human behavior, right? Because, well, certainly morality is one where it's very complicated, but the object itself may be entirely a construction of the human mind. So if you want to understand it, you should be looking at how people think about it, which is not how it's always done, or it's not always how it has been done in philosophy, because a lot of times it's from the armchair and thinking about metaphysics and things like that, and not taking human data seriously. So morality is a good domain to think about it. Humans as a source of understanding the phenomenon itself.
Yeah.
And thinking how people think about the mind is kind of in between, right? Because the mind is a biological, physical object, and there are truths about how the brain operates. And obviously, there's going to be some truths that we're going to end up knowing about what free will actually is or isn't eventually, that, human intuitions can't tell us completely about. But I think it's an untapped source of insight into it.
I mean, having done a lot of cross-cultural work on people's intuitions about the importance of, say, intentions in uh, moral transgressions, the role of knowledge in informing a person's choices,
Hmm.
um, and even to a certain extent in terms of people's moral judgments. Do you see a universality in the structure of moral cognition and mind reading, for lack of a better term, that around the world people carve up the social world in roughly similar ways and make inferences in roughly similar ways? Or do you take more of a view that this is really open-ended and profoundly shaped by culture, such that there aren't really universal organizing principles? I know I'm painting a character of two extreme positions, and
Yeah.
presumably you lie somewhere in between. But I'm curious how you've been thinking about this, having gathered a lot of cross-cultural data on these questions. What do you see as the universal people, to use a term that Dave and I like from Don Brown? Is there a universal people, and what do those people look like?
Well, that is the million-dollar question right there.
Yeah,
Which, if I could answer that succinctly, I would be done with my research project. But I think the answer to what, so I mean, the answer to the first question you asked is, in this continuum of how much commonality versus difference is there, in
yeah.
how people think about the mind and how it's related to ideas about morality around the world. I think there's a lot more similarity or universality um, than some anthropologists might think, for example. Although I'm also reluctant to attribute these beliefs to anthropologists. Oftentimes in this sort of divide between psychology and anthropology, the psychologists are seen as the universalists, and the anthropologists are the cultural relativists. And
Yeah.
you know, I've spent a lot of time recently, in communities of cultural anthropologists, and I'm not at all convinced that that's the right description of the distinction.
Mhm.
Anyway, that said, there's no question that there's a perfectly plausible intuition that um, our views about the mind are radically different across cultures. And my intuitive sense is no. In the cases where, I've done what I can do in terms of a deep dive into models of the mind that different cultures have, you do see a lot of commonality, and you would expect it to be that way, given that, to the extent that there are universal properties of the mind, then you would hope that, folk models of the mind or cultural models of the mind would converge in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
And I think they do. And it's, so there are these classic questions in, for example, the questions about language and thought, about how different languages carve up mental state terms, emotion terms. You see differences there. I think some people maybe amplify those differences too much. I think, the um, one way that you can think about it is that there's, these different sort of cultural models of the mind have different kind of vibes or flavors to them, something like that.
Hmm.
Um, that they may emphasize, so just to take one example, philosophical models of the mind in the West, which I take as one sort of cultural lineage, the one stretching back to the Greeks and Aristotle and Plato and stretching up into kind of European philosophy of mind in the 19th century and so on, are very oriented towards rationality and conscious thought processes and processes of inference and deduction. Philosophers have been obsessed with this stuff, and people in cognitive science as well, right? And I think, everywhere in the world, people can understand those kinds of processes, but I think there are other kinds of cultural models of the mind that see those aspects of cognition as being a pretty small slice of the pie compared to things like embodied physical knowledge and skill that come out through the way that you move your body and the way that you sense the world, that is sort of not heavily rational or maybe more on the intuitive end of things, right?
Mm.
Mhm.
And all models of the mind are capable of dealing with those different kinds of things. But I think it's interesting, even when I mean, I've written a little bit about this lately. I mean, even when you look at the history of cognitive science, the focus on rationality and processes of explicit conscious inference and stuff like that has really driven the model of the mind that cognitive science has had for quite a while. And it's weird that the embodiment turn in cognitive science and things like 4E cognition, are pretty recent things. I mean, you can find them there throughout the history of
Just what are the four
philosophy.
E's for
The
those
four
who
E's are what is it? One of you guys will know this.
embodied, uh,
I
Embodied,
can look it up. We
enacted.
can
It's embodied, enacted, um,
probably environments in there, maybe. I don't actually don't.
ecology. I actually don't know.
It's not electricity.
extended.
Extended, that's it. Right.
Extended, right? Because
Yeah.
the idea is that you have prostheses of your mind
Right.
acting in the
Yes.
world. So
Yes.
kind of like the extended phenotype kind of view.
I got it.
Hmm.
Embodied, embedded, and active,
Embedded.
and extended.
Extended, there you go.
Right.
I'm not
Okay.
surprised we didn't remember. It's not super.
Well, and it's,
Yeah, yeah,
to be fair, academia loves acronyms, and so
yeah.
finding
Totally.
four
Yes.
E's in a row is a real coup there.
It's
Jackpot, four
excellent.
E's.
Yeah.
But
It's an
but it,
egregious. Yeah. No, sorry.
that said, it is, I mean, every E there matters, right? And for
Yeah.
an evolutionary psychologist, we can understand every single one of those, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so anyway, the point is, when I said there's sort of flavors or vibes of different approaches to the mind, I think that's true. And then in the way that we see the mind kind of highlights or plays down different kinds of aspects
Yeah.
that change over time and across cultures. And, they're not necessarily wrong. I mean, even somebody like Freud, if you go back and read Freud's stuff, of course he got some stuff wrong, but actually you know, his his books are like packed with insights about how the mind works. And
Yeah.
he had a particular model. We were just talking, before we started recording about id and ego and all these things, which are terms that we don't use anymore, but they were referring to something that's intelligible.
Yeah.
And anyway, so that's I think that's the interesting space when we think about linguistic and cultural differences in
Right.
models of the mind. And the argument that I would make is just that we should, when there are these different, slightly different varieties or flavors of mental state terms, ways of carving up the space of the mind and the body um, around the world, and they're ones that have been around for a long time, they probably contain some useful insights about the mind that we should pay attention to.
Yeah. No, it's interesting even there. So I certainly agree that in Western culture, this view of the autonomous, rational agent that's disconnected from his surroundings, and it's usually a he, and exerting these top-down principles to manipulate the environment, and it's all conscious and calculated. it's certainly, a rough sketch of a potential cultural difference you might see between the West and the rest. Um, but even there, like, I still get the other view. I still
Sure.
get the idea of just feeling things out and like using your intuition and feeling the vibes and like feeling it in your body. Like, if you think about one of the most culturally impactful uh, cinematic universe is Star Wars. So my daughter is obsessed with Star Wars, so I've been watching a lot of it. So that's on my mind. The Force is very much the opposite of like a conscious, rational manipulation of the world. It's just feeling it out, feeling your connection to the rest of the world.
Mhm.
Yoda is always delivering these lines about you're overthinking it, Luke. There is no try. You either do it or you don't. Um,
Yeah.
and that to me is very reminiscent of the types of things you're talking about. You sort of learn to just feel it as opposed to think it. And I think a lot of people understand that on a gut
Yes.
level. Certainly, our culture might be, biased toward one end of the continuum, but I think the flavors, you could think about it to use your analogy of flavors. We all have tongues with certain taste buds, and we have, the conscious rationality taste bud, but we also have the embodied vibes-based taste bud. And maybe the Western palate, is more geared toward, the rational conscious taste bud, but we still have that other taste bud. We still know what it is. And it might be that other cultures, their palate is more geared toward the embodied taste bud. So even there,
Yeah.
I think there's more universality than it might seem on its face.
Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, that is right, and that's also a classic kind of insight for when you learn a term that is present in another language and not your own. I mean, the classic one is when we all learn what Schadenfreude is, and we hear
Yeah.
that term that we didn't know when we were kids, and
Yeah.
when we speak English, and it makes perfect sense because we felt it or seen someone else feel it. And so, yeah, I think that all of the palette of or the flavor profile is available to everyone. For science and for other kinds of things, the question is, what are the consequences of the variations that are there? And so, one of the things that I think for science is, you know, we may not, because of the fish and water issue of the kinds of cultural models that we've been brought up in, you know, when we're trying to create a universal sort of theory of human cognition, we may not notice that our theories are kind of heavy in certain areas or biased towards certain areas and kind of light on other areas. Um, and so with the kind of you know in the West also, when we talk about these processes of rationality and deliberation, right, these are not just parts of models of the mind, again, that everyone can understand. There's no question there. But they're not just parts of models of the mind. They actually end up having, well, I would argue they end up having moral and ethical force. They become values. So when you look at the way
Mm.
that Western education is targeted, it's very much targeted towards training our logical facilities, and things like that. I mean, and we know that that doesn't have to be the way it is. I mean, your example of Star Wars,
Yeah.
or other kinds of cases where, and I think these are actually pretty common around the world, where the pinnacle of wisdom would be acting without um, conscious deliberation,
Hmm.
essentially.
Yeah.
And it corresponds to this Bourdieu notion of habitus, right? So the book that I was mentioning to you guys is called Southern Epistemologies, that's just coming out. It's a collection of essays on how people in the Andes and Amazon think about knowledge. And so, as part of that, I've been taking a deep dive into the Quechua language, which I don't speak. But it has the way that it carves up knowledge, the primary knowledge word is called yachai, which my understanding is it's embodied knowledge. So it's, when you're walking on the path that you've walked your entire life, your body just sort of takes you along the path. And um, in this sort of cultural setting, my understanding is, the pinnacle of being an intelligent, rational, in some ways, actor in the world, a wise actor, is to, basically have all of the important knowledge subsumed into a sort of subcognitive, if you will, space where you just act. Um, and so it's interesting, right? Because that is a cultural model of like there's a kind of virtue ideology in there about what being a truly knowing being is. That's a little different than kind of maybe if you grew up in 19th century England or Germany, where it would be the ability to manipulate propositions in some way to generate certain inferences or something like that using logical calculus, which is also valid, but just different.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that, if you're watching like kids on YouTube or like I'm watching old Michael Jordan clips or a musician or an athlete just do something really well and just sort of reveling in, man, this is just it's art, it's just
Yeah.
this somebody has just nailed how to do this thing so beautifully. Again, I think it goes back to David's point, which is we can all understand it, but it
Mhm.
goes back to your point too, Clark, that you don't value it, or maybe it just gets compartmentalized to sort of like it's what the kids are doing on the playground, or it's the status scheme of like, yeah, I got to learn logic, but I really want to be like the best like
Yeah.
basketball player I can be. Um,
Right.
yeah,
I think that model of the mind is more prevalent in the arts than and perhaps in athletics than it is in, say, the sciences or the humanities,
Yeah.
or even the business world, because that's what you need to do to be successful in your career is to cultivate that kind of embedded, embodied knowledge of your craft.
Yeah.
But with a top-down discipline such as ours, that kind of knowledge and wisdom is less desired because I can't prove it to you. I can't set it down on paper
Yeah.
and walk you through the propositional logic and have you say, "Ah, I get it." Whereas, with art, the proof is in the pudding. It's in the painting. It's in the feat of athleticism. But with a scientific discipline, we all need to agree
Yep.
on what is correct. Yeah, I don't know.
that's yeah,
So
that's interesting. Yeah, Clark,
so I,
you were gonna say something. Oh,
you're
sorry,
gonna say
Clark, you're
something?
gonna say something. Yeah.
No, I think that's really insightful. I think yeah, we maybe, those of us who are doing evolutionary psychology, you know, maybe we don't think enough about the fact that it's essentially a verbal format that science that we do is written and with pictures,
Yeah,
um, and visual and verbal. And that what part of what we're doing is rhetoric and persuasion, and you have people like Hugo Mercier and others, who have argued that these kinds of things are about changing other people's minds and so on. And it makes sense that we focus on these skills of rhetoric and debate and logic. It also makes me at least worry, right? Because if you believe somebody like Mercier or others, the target of those things is not necessarily the truth,
yeah,
um, and so we do have to worry about that a little bit.
yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely worries me as well. I mean, on the one hand, it is somewhat comforting in that the collective emergent result of all this arguing and debate among a scientific institution that has good incentives should, in theory, produce, true beliefs or truer beliefs over time, right? It has a
Yeah.
kind of self-corrective mechanism. But when you zoom in on any individual part of that apparatus, any individual scientist, they are very unlikely to have the whole truth inside of their head.
Mhm.
And since I am an individual person, within that apparatus, that's very worrying because I want to have the whole truth. I want to have
Yeah.
the answers. And what Mercier and others' research has told me is that that is impossible, and I need to give up, give up hope.
Right.
And that's worrying.
Yeah.
I want to pick your brain on another idea that came to me about spirituality and religiosity and supernatural concepts,
Mhm.
and the connection between this embodied, embedded model of the mind and spiritual and supernatural belief. Because it seems like there is a connection there. So when the Force is a supernatural force in Star Wars, like it's literally magic. You're You have telekinesis. You're picking up objects with your mind, and I find that when people who lean more on this flavor profile of intuitive, embedded, embodied knowledge, they tend to be more spiritual, or at least talk in more spiritual terms. And it may be that when something is opaque to us or unconscious, that we sort of fill in the gaps of our ignorance with supernatural concepts. And so that might be why you see a greater prevalence of spiritual beliefs in cultures with a more intuitive, embodied model of the mind, because so much of the magic is coming from forces unknown,
Yeah.
and it just becomes very easy to just put those forces unknown into a supernatural bucket. It's the ancestors, it's a spirit, it's the force, it's whatever. I mean, do you buy that way of thinking?
Um, yeah, I think that, yeah, that seems right. I mean, I've never been a huge fan of the argument, the sort of God of the gaps type of argument,
Mhm.
that the function of sort of spirituality is to maybe comfort us or explain things that we don't know. But I don't
Sure.
take you as saying that exactly.
Yeah.
But I do think, that there's this sense. So if you are someone who values and pays attention to your intuitions and the embodied feelings that you have as you're going through the world, and you try to develop a sense of intuitive connection with your physical and sensory presence in the world,
Yeah.
there's going to be stuff that pops out at you where it's going to get your attention.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one component of it, right? Because if you look at, I don't know, I feel like this in Los Angeles. I mean, I try to cultivate that side of myself. But I also, I go on hikes all the time, and I mean, people are out there walking, like literally reading a cell phone on a trail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're not in touch with, as far as I can tell,
They're
they're
micro learning, Clark. They're micro learning.
Yeah, I mean, they're
They're
definitely, they're choosing to devote their attention to something, but there has to be a cost that they're not attending to what's going on around them, right? And so,
Mhm.
anyway, that's the kind of thing where I would say that, that's going to pull you away from some of these ineffable experiences that lead to a sense of spiritual connectedness to the world, and that there's stuff out there.
yeah.
That that beyond you, that you can sense occasionally in the periphery, or maybe even directly. Those all come connected with this kind of yachai embodied knowledge view. And I also think that, when we think about the hyper rationalists of Europe,
Yeah.
Immanuel Kant and people like this. I mean, some of them were believed in God, and some of them were atheists, but there's no question that the sort of move towards excessive sort of rationality was part of, what Max Weber has called disenchantment, where um, people argued their way out of God using logic. I mean, there's some interesting cases to the contrary, like Descartes and others who tried to use logic and introspection to prove that God exists. I never was persuaded by the argument that there has to be a perfect being because I've never experienced one through my senses. And so the only way that I could know this is if they existed and planted the idea in my mind. That seems like a weird kind of proof. But the point is, like, when you get into that space of logic and rationality, it it does lead you away from it can lead you away from a spiritual attitude about the world. So I think that's another component of it. Where,
That's
yeah.
cool. Yeah, it reminds me there's a Konrad Lorenz. It's called the Russian manuscript. It apparently was like posthumous. So Konrad Lorenz was in a Russian gulag during World War II because he fought for the Nazis, and he wrote this with like bird beaks on like burlap sacks or whatever, but it was all
Hmm.
these notes, and it came out in
Mhm.
the 70s. Like somebody found it in like some attic in the 70s. But what it's really amazing. Like I think every evolutionary psychologist should read this book, the Russian manuscript by Konrad Lorenz. But it basically talks about how Konrad Lorenz, they were doing the ethology, and he was talking about the early 20th century fight between the vitalists and the mechanists of animal cognition. And what he was saying as an ethologist is even though he was on the side of the mechanists and not thinking there was some magical spirit, he was sort of like the mechanists are all these people in the lab. Like I'm
Mhm.
glossing over things, but basically it
Yeah.
was sort of like there's no beauty or art or nature in the models. And it reminded me of what you're saying, which is sort of
Yeah.
like there's sort of I think there was sort of a historical accident of like, well, if we're gonna be hard-nosed scientists about it, we're gonna study rats in a maze, and we're not gonna think about like nature
Yeah.
or cool functions. And that was sort of what Conrad Lorenz was saying too. And so, like, I think there was like a false choice between a rich environmental biological view and but it was like vitalistic versus it was mechanical, but it was like concrete and math and zeros and ones and like very sterile.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I also think that, we're seeing in some ways, I mean, there are these cultural trends about how we think about the world and cognition and our place in the world, and there's a kind of winding path. Like I mentioned, the importance of embodiment in sort of the cognitive sciences, it kind of comes and goes. But right now, for example, in when we think about animal rights and ethics, there's this move towards rights of nature kind of perspectives, which view non-human beings as having a moral status and ethical status, partly due to the fact that they have internal lives and things like that. I mean, that actually fits very well with an evolutionary view. It fits very well with a lot of indigenous perspectives on the relationship between humans and other non-human beings. It doesn't fit very well with the 19th century European view that only humans have rationality. That's what gives us our status as moral beings. Um, that's the source of a lot of that disjuncture in a lot of ways. And I would say that this sort of there's a parallel when we think about animal behavior where for a long, and I think Lorenz might have been talking about this, for a long time, it was sort of forbidden to anthropomorphize or what people would call anthropomorphize other species. For understandable reasons, I guess you could say, well, you don't want to project human specific processes or values onto things that aren't human when they don't share them. But that extended that went way overboard, right?
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
the point where now you have animal behaviorists. I mean, I remember an article within the last 10 years, that hit like the New York Times that announced that dogs feel pain because they had managed
Yeah.
to put a dog into an fMRI scanner and show that the pain areas in the dog's brain homologously, were activated under conditions of pain in a way, same way that humans are. I mean,
Yeah.
it is an interesting study, that's for sure. But,
Yeah.
you know, in some sense, the pendulum has, swang way too far in our, um, attempt to be hyper rationalistic about not attributing things to other species. And now you all probably know there's just really interesting stuff on plant cognition now,
Yeah.
Yeah.
a whole field of it that's pretty that's pretty interesting and very, very scientific.
Yeah, that stuff
And
is
it,
wild.
it raises questions like what's going on? Is there consciousness? I mean, who knows? But there's no
Yeah.
question that there's like response to stimuli and reacting at pretty quick timescales to things that are happening, touch and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I don't want to go too far afield of
Yeah.
the next topic. I actually this reminded me hunting magic. Can you talk a little bit about hunting magic? Because I think this is a great example of the embodied thing concretely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I actually have I finally um, have a piece coming out on this in the edited volume. And for those audience members who speak Spanish, there already is a volume that came out in Spanish a couple of years ago um, on Andean and Amazonian epistemologies, and a version of this chapter is in there in Spanish. But there's an English language one coming out in June. And in this chapter, I talk about a little bit of what I have learned in Shuar communities about some of these hunting practices that include the singing of certain kinds of songs that are involved in hunting, And in the chapter, I sort of talk about, based on some interviews that I've done, the range of possibilities for of like how people think about those songs, how they think that they might work, whether or not they think that they might work. And
Sorry, so this takes place before the hunt?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so
Like
these are
immediately before, or like the
yeah,
previous
in the
day, or
morning, people get up like ridiculously early, basically while it's still dark, go out hunt and go out and they sing these songs, or they used to anyway, on the way out to the hunt, and it's kind of a private event that you're singing to yourself
Mm,
and singing to the forest and singing to these animals.
mhm,
And the lyrics of the songs, often are things like requests or commands, to the animals, or just statements like today I'm gonna kill this kind of animal, um, repeated with rhythm and music, melody. And so, one possibility that I discuss is, that these could be kind of technologies of the self, where they're basically getting the hunter into a particular kind of mental state and focus, that may actually have some effects. And there is some literature on this, like flow states and things like this in sports and the arts,
like
where,
a warm-up activity.
yeah,
You know, like
self-talk.
actors and athletes often have warm-up activities to sort of get themselves in the
Yep.
right mental state.
Yes,
Interesting.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Yes, and focusing the mind on certain kinds of outcomes by visualizing them,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And one thing that I could talk more about this if you have other things that you want to know about it, but the thing that I do in this paper, so that the chapter, is called "The Uncertain Virtues of Incomplete Knowledge," and it's talking about how, this phenomenon where most of the things that we do, where we deploy some kind of technology, nobody knows everything about how the technology works, um, and that's an interesting thing, right? It's ordinary, actually. Most of the things that we do are in a state of incomplete knowledge. And there's great work in cognitive science on this. People like Frank Kyle and others who've shown that nobody knows how a toilet works. I mean, it's not, the plumber does, right?
Yeah.
But
But
the
when
plumber
you
doesn't know how a helicopter works, right? Like, yeah,
That's
exactly.
right.
Yeah.
And we don't, people can't even really like reproduce a proper bicycle from memory
Yeah.
because we have an accurate model of what's going on. And of course, you use a cell phone, you have no idea how it works, but it does. And so, you learn these procedures and you do them. And then the idea is that if the conditions of efficacy hold, then what you're doing is going to work. And so you can have limited knowledge. And the case of Anent, these particular songs in Shuar, they've been around for a long time, and, they're transmitted, with great kind of respect, for this tradition. And so, most people now don't really know how to use them, um, but there's this view that, these are kind of ancestral technologies that helped and did things, and there's a trust in that. Um, and so in the chapter, what I compare it to is our use of statistics in science, and this is kind of, I do a callback to my postdoc that I did with Gerrit Gigerenzer and Peter Todd at the MPI in Berlin, where, one of Gigerenzer's, ideas was that we use statistical rituals in psychology and other fields, especially null hypothesis significance testing, where, people just, you can plug something into an algorithm and you get some numbers out, and then people interpret those in a certain way, which is often wrong. And so, there's two levels of kind of incomplete knowledge there. Sometimes people don't know, often people don't know the conditions of efficacy, for the statistics to give the right answer, right? And so we are trained that there have to be normal distributions and all these things, but often people ignore those. And there's other more technical stuff that people don't run the checks to make sure that the model is appropriate for what they're doing. And then there's a second level, which is, they misunderstand what the p-value means. Um, so in this piece, I'm kind of bringing those two together to say, isn't this an interesting comparison? Because usually when we think about something like a indigenous hunting technology, it's often viewed by anthropologists as superstition or, something that can't possibly have any effects in the world that matter. But when
Hmm.
you look at what I'm focusing on is sort of people's attitudes towards them, which are very reminiscent of the attitudes that we have in science, where you trust some ancestors who were rigorous and made sure that this procedure works. And they tell us you can only do it under these circumstances. And if you do it this way, it'll work. And we trust that and we do it. And if everything is working right, I mean, if we're in some sort of equilibrium condition or where the efficacy conditions still hold, then we trust that the effects that we want are going to happen. And so that's kind of where I've been thinking in that space that, science has more of that kind of stuff than we like to think. And it
Hmm.
may make use, and it makes use of social processes. I mean, many philosophers of science have talked about these social processes in science, that trust is critical. Nobody can know everything. There's a cognitive division of labor. Um, and all those things are true. And
Yeah.
there's a
It,
double-edgedness to them.
I'm
in
just imagining like a group of scientists joining hands and dancing around a fire pit, singing P is less than 0.05.
Right. Yes.
put that into Dolly. Is the in Clark, is the point, like, I can imagine there's like a couple points, like, is it to sort of humble scientific chauvinism, or like what's the
Mhm.
or do you have a couple, like, what's the point, you know?
Uh, I think that's yes. Yes. I mean, what I have in mind is the um, importance of reflecting on what it is that we don't know. So yeah,
Yeah,
something like humility, but it's also the sort of ethnographic part is intended to be an intervention in this space in anthropology where often people think when they think about something like a ritual, um, the sort of view is, well, this is a completely mindless repetition of certain kinds of procedures without any reflection on what they are or why they work.
right.
And my point is, in Shuar communities and any other community where there's ritual, I mean, when you go into church as a Catholic and get communion as a
Yeah,
kid, you're like, what the hell is this?
yeah,
Right. And I mean, everyone is essentially, right? And so that process of reflection is ordinary, and sort of knowing that you don't know is ordinary. And so we should think about these practices that have happened historically in that way, and then comparing it with what's going on in science is kind of interesting. And right now I'm on a little bit of a journey of worrying about some of the features of science that we don't attend to enough that could lead to error. And
yeah,
so it's part of that as well. I mean,
yeah,
I talking back to scientists and saying, don't be so confident that um, I think, for example, the problem of overdoing statistics in behavioral science is a real problem. I mean, you go through these papers that are just completely full of statistical models, and at the end, it can be like, okay, but is that really true what you're claiming on the basis of all these graphs?
yeah.
Um, and we tend to be bewildered by these things. I mean, they have a beguiling effect, almost like magic.
Do you think
Yeah.
it's almost like intimidation? I mean, is that too blunt, but is it sort of like people just get intimidated by it and they're like, well, this seems sciency.
Yeah. I definitely think there's a kind yeah, there's a rhetorical persuasive effect of like um and if you question the conclusions, then one kind of way of defending yourself, say, okay, so show me where this model is wrong or something like
It's
that.
like
Of course, we
defensive.
should we should be able to do that, but there are plenty of times I feel where I read a paper and I'm like, okay, yeah, but you know, there's just fancier and fancier versions of doing things like mistaking correlation for causation. I mean, it's all over the
Yeah.
place in behavioral science.
Yeah. This whole conversation is making me realize that a lot of our supernatural concepts are correct in a way. So if you think about it, if you have a kind of embodied and active intelligence where I'm, say, inferring your mental states, your beliefs and desires and intentions, and I have no idea how I do that because it's unconscious and it's just happening in an intuitive way, that is basically telepathy.
Hmm.
I mean, or at least it's telepathy, but the causal process that allows it to emerge is just opaque to me, right?
Yep.
If I'm making an unconscious inference about what's going to happen next or tomorrow, and it does happen, that is a kind of precognition if I don't know the causal process that happens in between the inference and the event, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And, similarly, if I have a hunting technology that has evolved culturally down the generations and has been proven effective because of that cultural evolutionary process, and it helps me hunt an animal, that literally is my ancestors helping me, right? It
Yeah.
is, you could think of it as the ghost of my ancestors helping me catch this animal. So there is a way in which all of these concepts are correct if certain parts of the causal process are opaque to you. And it may be that a lot of supernatural concepts are just shorthand.
Yeah.
I'm just describing the way in which the ancestors have helped me. I'm describing the way in which it seems to me that I can just read your thoughts or I can predict what's going to happen. These are kinds of magical things, literally. If you don't know how it works, it's just magic.
Hmm.
I don't know. Do you buy that way of thinking that the intuitiveness of a lot of these concepts just comes from the fact that the causal process is opaque, and once you snip out the middle of the causal sequence, it's indistinguishable from magic.
Yes, definitely. I definitely think there's something there. And I also agree with what you're saying about th that. So, I mean, I was giving I mentioned like Freud and the ego and the id, and there's these kind of ways he had of dividing up the mind. And then there's this question of do those refer to anything at all?
Mhm.
Um, And one view would be no, those are just completely hallucinated or whatever. But there's an analogy to what you're talking about, David, where there may be words for things, intuition, insights, and things like this, which do refer to something real.
Yeah,
But we don't have a grasp of them in psychology enough to be able to. They have a flavor of they're not real or they're imagined, but because maybe they're folk terms. Maybe, we don't have a proper neural model of how it would work or something like that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of, uh, there can be a lot of things like that. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even in LA, there's a lot of, I'm in social networks that are, sort of quasi-spiritual into
Yeah.
astrology and stuff. And there are these
Yep.
people in LA, these intuitives. And basically what it is you go up to them and they just kind of just listen to you and observe you and are just extremely attentive to every detail about you. And they just tell you stuff about yourself that
Mm.
might not have been apparent to you,
Mm.
right? Your
Yep.
your desires, your character traits, your personality, what you want in life. And it seems to me that, these people are just they're really good at social cognition. They're just
Yeah.
really good at picking up on, subtle cues of body language and dress and posture, and they just give you a readout of their intuitions about you. And to a lot of people, that can be really powerful. And give them insights that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And because they don't know how it's happening, it feels like magic. It feels like a supernatural thing. It's just a person who's just really socially intelligent. And merely just being around someone who's socially intelligent can feel like magic. It can feel like a spiritual experience.
Yep.
Um,
Absolutely.
Do they self-label as intuitive?
I believe they do. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so
I mean,
Sherlock Holmes, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, some
Cool.
of them are
Yeah,
spiritualists or whatever. There are
yeah.
different words for it, but that's basically, a lot of what it is. And I imagine that's pretty common to all, even tarot card readers or palm readers. I imagine a big part of what they're doing is just reading the body language and the dress and the mannerisms of the person and just weaving it into their narratives about what the cards reveal or what the lines on their palm reveal.
Hmm.
I would imagine that's a big part of how they pull off the magic trick.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so another kind of domain that I've been thinking about a lot is Um, so I have this paper that came out pretty recently with Alejandro Erut and Chris Smith in Cognition called "Lying About the Future," and it's based on vignette style interviews and stuff that we've done in Schwar communities um, that originally were about trying to nail down what people think is a lie or what people would consider to be a lie. Um, and there's an interesting phenomenon in that paper. There's also some cross-cultural data that that the Schwar people that we interviewed, there are many kinds of predictions about the future that they would consider to be a lie if the prediction doesn't come true. And ones that I would consider kind of strange from my cultural background. And things like doctors making a prognosis that turns out to be wrong. Um, and that there's other examples too. And so in the paper, we kind of try to say, is it about the social identity of the person that they're not trustworthy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in the end, it seems to be that making a confident statement about the future when you don't know it's true is considered a lie, which differs from commitments about the future where it's under your control. So people do seem to agree. If I promise that I'm going to be on the Zoom call at 9 a.m., but something happens to me and the power goes out at my house or something, I didn't lie, right?
Hmm.
Um, but there are things where I say, oh, this is going to happen tomorrow. And if it doesn't, that's considered a lie. I think there can be, I mean, that's not necessarily so culturally strange, but the reason I'm mentioning it is because there are really interesting views in this community about like knowing the future. And there are kind of ideas that the future can be known through things like using ayahuasca, but also that dreams foretell the future. And one reason I'm mentioning it is because you're talking about, spirituality and could there be things, magical things that are real or whatever that we don't quite understand. And so
Yeah.
thinking about this started to get me thinking about, well, can you know something through a dream?
Yeah.
I think the conventional answer would be no. But the more I started to think about that, the more I realized actually there's plenty of cases where I have a dream and I wake up in the morning and I'm like, wait a second. And I realize something. I mean, do you know that you know from the dream? Think things like where a
Yeah.
dream will tell you something about how you feel about another
Yeah.
person, right?
Yeah.
And you wake up and you're like, I didn't realize that's how I saw that person, that they're a threat to me or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
And so do I do I know for sure that you can know things through dreams? I don't know, but I do think it's something that's been dismissed, quite a bit because, dream
Yeah.
interpretation is
I
considered
mean,
kind of a
a
not
lot of
really.
artists and musicians have personal accounts of they dream up a melody in their sleep and it becomes like their hit
Yeah.
song. Like Paul McCartney famously, I believe, dreamt up the melody of, might have been Yesterday, I forget. One of his like
Mm.
most famous songs just came to him in a dream. He just woke up and it was in his head and he just wrote it down. And a lot of other artists have stories like that where like they have creative insights
Yeah.
while they're dreaming. And it could be that there's something about the unconscious churning that happens when you're dreaming. It can sometimes give you insights that you wouldn't have otherwise had
Yep.
when you're awake. I mean, this happens all the time. If I'm, sometimes I'll have a realization that happens to me like unconsciously while I'm not thinking about it. Like sometimes thinking about something is a bad way to figure it out, and the solution will come to you when you're not thinking about it. And it
Yes.
could be that dreaming is a similar kind of process where it's just kind of scanning the space of your cognition for possible solutions in a way that's more distributed and decentralized than conscious thought. And oftentimes that kind of trawling the space for solutions is a more effective way to arrive at an insight than conscious deliberation.
Hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, John Cleese has a great short YouTube video about creativity or how do you be funny all the time. And it's
yeah,
exactly this point, David, that it's you have to do a lot of conscious work, but then you have to just sort of shut that off and trust the non-conscious walk away from it
yeah,
process happen, but it's effortful to sort of like throw it into the you kind of cook it in an oven and you don't know what's going on subconsciously. And I get this experience. I don't know if you guys get it, even when I'm writing, like I'll work and work at like, or like, how am I going to articulate this thing? and then I just can't do it. But then I walk away, but then I'm doing something else. Like I'm going for a walk, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh no, this is the way to do it. So clearly that thing was just sort of going on in a way that quote unquote I wasn't controlling. But I did all the effort to sort of load up all the ingredients and then just throw it into the subconscious. Yeah.
Right. There's a cool theory of dreaming. I'm blanking on the guy who thought of it. But the idea is that we're constantly building predictive models of the world around us, and in the same way that AIs often overfit, they over generalize from local patterns and make rules that don't apply more broadly. The human mind can overfit.
Yeah.
Based on the data of a transient experience or a local experience. And the idea is in the same way that you often, AI technicians will often just feed a bunch of random noise into a predictive model so that it doesn't overfit and overgeneralize from one data set. The idea is that dreaming is the same, serves the
Okay.
same function, that it prevents
Hmm.
us from overfitting and just by feeding random noise into our predictive models. And that's a big part of the function of dreaming. And that goes along with this idea that, yeah, maybe you can arrive at some insights through
Yep.
dreaming, and maybe it's not all bullshit. Um, and
Yep.
This
and you know maybe the part of it that is giving you real insights is the part of it that lends itself to these cultural belief systems. You know,
Yeah, and Clark, you mentioned like drugs or hallucinogens. I mean, this is a weird question, maybe a weird direction, but is there any cognitive science sort of, I mean, people seem to use that and find it personally meaningful in some contexts, or sort of
Mm-hmm.
like insight is gained. And
Mhm.
I can imagine sort of a story of it's sort of mixing ontologies that aren't typically mixed or systems that aren't usually talking to each other. Do you have you thought about that? I mean, you mentioned that a little bit. Like what's going on with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have thought about it, but and I do know that there is, especially with things like ayahuasca, which is a mix of several different plants. It's a kind of tea made of several different plants that has DMT is one of the main ingredients, but there's many psychoactive ingredients in there, and monoamine oxidase inhibitors and many other things. And so it's a kind of technology that alters your mental states. And there's been a lot of interest in it for all kinds of reasons. I mean, I think the number of people who have tried this has gone way up in places like California and Europe and other places, but also, interest in those things for therapies and other kinds of things. And I think that um, there's some research on it, but I also think that I know that there's a huge problem with using those things. You can't do kind of like blind randomized assignment because people know when they've been given the stuff that is psychoactive.
Yeah, you can't be blind. Yeah,
Um,
you can't be blind. Yeah.
and so, because there have been attempts to do, these sort of randomized control trials and see what effects they have on various things like definitely things like depression. It's been talked about for breaking out of alcoholism and other kinds of addictions,
Hmm.
but also the cognitive effects. So there is research. I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
not an expert on it though.
Yeah. But it's just an interesting, it just reminded me sort of this other thing of where it reminded me of David's point about dreaming, just that, there's a phenomenon there of people sort of using a technology to just sort of
Yeah.
it's sort of consuming this is a weird thing I'm experiencing and using that as a tool essentially.
Yes. Putting yourself into a different mental state. And
Taking
yes.
yourself out of like overly rigid priors that have
Mhm.
developed because
Yeah.
in Bayesian
Yeah.
learning sometimes you can get stuck in a rut where
Yeah.
if your prior is too high and every piece of evidence you find can confirm the prior and then you get stuck in this rut. Sometimes a dream or a psychedelic experience can shake you out of that rut
Yep.
by giving you some new stimuli that you wouldn't have otherwise experienced.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. Cool.
Yeah. Don't do
Yeah.
drugs.
So speaking
Don't
of
do drugs.
spirits and ghosts,
PSA. PSA.
I remember back when I was at UCLA and I was in seminars with you, Clark. You told a story that uh, really stuck with me. For some reason, I love these stories of ghosts killing people. So we had an episode with Brenda Bowser, and she told a story about there was a murder, and there was like blood all over the walls, and the village council came in and they investigated the crime scene, and they determined that the murder was caused by a phantasm or ghost.
Mhm.
And we really got into the details of what was going on there and what kinds of social functions that narrative was serving, or whether they truly believed that it was a ghost, or whether they were doing it to sort of stem the cycle of violence that would have resulted if they had pinned it on a particular person.
Right.
You told a similar story about, I believe, two guys. They maybe two or three, I forget. They went off to the river or something,
Yeah.
and then they came back, and one of them didn't come back. Could you
Yeah.
recount that story? Because it has haunted me all these years.
Well, yeah, it was a case where someone died. I mean, the body ended up being found in the river,
Mhm.
and it was on a hunting trip. And if yeah, I believe that there were three people and two came back. There may have been more. I wasn't there. All I know is, that this event ended up being kind of debated and discussed in a similar kind of way to what you're referring to in the community where Brenda was working, which I believe was Canambo.
Mhm.
And so where I was, this was a Cheviar community in the late 90s. And the thing is with these it actually was probably a fishing trip, if I remember right. So um, the way that the fishing works there is they use this plant poison called barbasco, which is a kind of vine. Actually, it contains one of the first things that was extracted from plants in a commercial way to use as a pesticide. The active material basically binds with hemoglobin, and so it suffocates you. And it's actually also a great technology because you put it in the river. It's kind of this milky substance. It kills the fish, but it's perfectly safe to eat the fish
Mm.
Mhm.
because the fish have basically been suffocated, but all of the chemicals have bound inside the fish, and it doesn't hurt you. If you drank it yourself, that is a way that you can, poison someone or commit suicide. But in any case, the way that you do it is, one person goes upstream, or one or more people will go upstream with a big basket of this stuff and like pound it pound it um, to kind of pulp out this white stuff into the water, and then the fish start to float downstream, and so people are positioned at different places along the
Mhm.
river to sort of collect the fish as they're floating downstream. And so there's this point where people separate, and they separated, and when they came back together, the claim was that they just found this guy floating in the river, and so that it had been, yeah, a non-human spiritual being that killed this guy.
Mm.
And then, yeah, a debate ensued about whether that was not true, and it was an excuse that it was actually a murder, and so on. And so that is the kind that yeah, that's how that was
And,
framed.
and I remember there was a piece of dialogue you recounted that stuck with me in the ensuing debate, where they were debating whether it was a murder or whether it was a spirit. And one of the parties who was there, one of the three guys who came back, I believe he said something like, it was a spirit. And if you don't believe me, there's going to be a problem. Was it something like that? Do you remember?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, you remember it better than me now. But that's right. Basically, they um, in the context of the argument or debate, it was like this. This is what happened. Case closed. Um,
Yeah.
there'll be no more discussion of this. So a kind of authoritative.
Yeah.
And and
An
now
appeal to authority. Yeah.
and in that, David, like to just unpack it, is it
Yeah.
that it's a threat, but because there's ambiguity of whether or not the threat's coming from the spirit versus me, is that the sort of technology or the social strategy there?
It was for one of the families, or one of the parties. It was better for them in the social situation to have that be the story, basically. And so
Yeah,
they're basically saying this is what happened.
I see.
Um,
Yeah.
And
And presumably they had the social and political authority to make like
mhm,
presumably
that's right.
that family was high status enough and had enough allies and support that they
Yeah.
could say that and make the threat and have it be heeded.
That's right. Yep.
Hmm.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Super
mean,
cool. Anyway,
it's a case of, yeah, it's a case of kind of in a relatively small community of kind of like, yeah, use of numerical strength or whatever to
yeah,
push one's case through, but that, it doesn't mean that the other people. I mean, we know all kinds of cases of this from politics, right?
yeah,
Where you know, someone strong says, "This is the way it is,"
yeah,
and I don't want to hear any other discussion of this going forward, right? Doesn't mean that the other parties don't continue to hold the representation that it wasn't that way.
right.
And so, this was a case of a kind of beef that lasted for multiple years, and it didn't extinguish the idea that this was a murder, although it did definitely, um, you know, make it so that that had to not really be discussed in
Or at least not op out in the open and
right. That's right.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
Clark, I have this reminds me of a question, which is those of us evolutionary behavioral scientists who don't go to the field, we have gotten into a tradition where we tell students that in um, non-weird cultures, if there's somebody in the community that really is problematic and like really problematic, occasionally there'll be a hunting accident.
Hmm.
Is this is this a urban legend? Is this true? I have never actually asked a credible anthro person, and I feel like you are one
Hmm.
of the best to ask that. Has that actually happened? Or is this sort of an urban legend that's kind of spun a little bit?
Well, I can't really say beyond my own. I mean, I have obviously read some ethnography from some other places, but I think, yeah, yeah. I mean, I would say, I would say that, yeah, in all kinds of places, rural places, it might be easier to maybe kill somebody or have them disappear.
Yeah,
Um, Happens in cities too, though,
yeah.
and I mean, it's not necessarily always that it's a kind of community punishment of someone. I think that it probably mostly isn't. It's more like a
Mm,
personal, this person is inconvenient to me, and so I'm going to get rid of them. And so, I mean, if you're a fan of the true crime podcast genre, you can find any number of those things happening in the US,
I
even
see.
now, where people
Yeah,
are like suddenly, this person left the house and they didn't come back and we don't know what happened to them. So I think, yeah,
mm,
those are the kinds of things in the case that we're talking about here was something like that. There was some kind of, well, one interpretation is there's some kind of beef um, that was extreme enough that somebody wanted to basically kill another person.
yeah. And that's the corollary of the suspects are the people who are in deep engaged relationships with the person. It's likely probabilistically not a stranger. So the initial suspects are,
Right.
and it's for this reason where it's the motivation behind doing it is this person's continually imposing a cost on me, and I need to do
Yeah.
something about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. And or, and some sort of possibly perception or calculation of that, whether that's really true or not. But also, whatever what they call acts of passion or something like that. Who knows?
Yeah.
Some of those things may also be that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're covering drugs and murder. We haven't hit rock and roll yet. Maybe we'll have Greg on. Oh, how's music? Shore music.
So our music is great. It's and there's quite a big music scene there, which is great. I mean, the sort of indigenous music scene in South America is burgeoning and really good.
Do they
What
do
what what kind of
atonal?
music
Yeah.
is it? Is it like drumming or
Well, now I mean, now there's just all of these like hybrid forms of,
Mhm.
so, there's a lot of Shuar artists, and people who sing in other indigenous languages who are using things like cumbia, techno cumbia, reggaeton, um, hip hop, other kinds of formats like that.
Cool.
The traditional Shuar instrumentation is like drums. They also have there's a kind of violin type of thing. People play guitars, flutes. But
Cool.
yeah, the young kids have been transforming this, as music does everywhere in the world, just taking all the ingredients and, it's I sometimes I get I'm an old man. I get grumpy about how music and film are going. I don't want movies made with AI, or music made with AI. But at the same time, we know that the technologies that are becoming available are, really create this like leveling of the playing field for people to make music. And that's happening in a lot of rural communities around the world. You just get these, kids who are just like, yeah, I'm gonna get a keyboard, and then they do their thing, and it's great.
Yeah, they have an orchestra at their fingertips.
Hmm.
Yeah, super
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. Music seems to me like one of the outstanding mysteries in the evolutionary social science, and aesthetics in
Yep.
general, I think.
Yep.
But music in particular, there are just a lot of really mysterious aspects to it, like how it just sticks in your memory so clearly, and how in particular it sticks in your memory like during your youth. Like during my teenage and 20s, like all the songs that I heard at that time are just burned into my memory. And when I listen to a song now, it just doesn't have the same sticking power. It doesn't have the same intensity, the same emotional intensity as
Yeah,
it did.
that's right.
And we're just awash in music, and it just has such a hugely powerful emotional effect on us.
Yeah.
I feel like there's so many aspects of it that are really mysterious and still have yet to be explained. I mean, I know Ed Hagen has some ideas
Hmm.
about what might be going on, about coordination and signaling group cohesion. I don't know if
Yeah.
I quite buy that as the whole story. Like it does, like I want an explanation of music that explains like why a minor third has a different vibe than a minor fifth, and like why the mathematical properties of
Mm.
a melody are the way they are. Like what is going on there? And I have no idea. Um,
We have to have Greg on maybe.
yeah, maybe we'll have Greg on and see if he can dispel the mystery. I mean, do you
Yeah.
view it as still an outstanding mystery, or do you find
Yes,
some ideas more
definitely. I mean,
plausible?
it's one of those things where I think calling back to your conversation that I was listening to with Daniel Nettle, he was making the point, which I agree with, that sometimes for complex phenomena like that, there's this tendency to want to assign some one function,
Yeah,
that's maybe overdoing it. Um,
yeah,
and so I think there's a lot of cases like this with a phenomenon like music, aesthetics, fiction, um, religion, other kinds of things like this, even morality, where um, it's a kind of, complex, emergent thing that definitely is the result of a lot of functional stuff. But to say that music has a function or one function, um, seems to me unlikely.
for
Even
sure.
even though some of these things that music can do is correct. I mean, music
Yeah,
can coordinate people.
yeah,
Music can change your emotions. It can uplift you. It can do all these things. But yeah, it's strange, and the particular the things that you're alluding to, David, like melody and chordal structure and stuff like that. I mean, I agree completely that there's a mystery there, and it's somewhere in the vein of also the mystery of mathematics, which has really intrigued me for a long time, that you have this symbolic system that has aesthetic properties that people find very, very appealing, and they discover new forms of mathematics through aesthetics in some way.
Mhm.
And they end up corresponding to the world. Absolutely
Mhm.
bizarre. How do we
Yeah,
explain that? Imaginary numbers were forbidden by Pythagoras, and then once they were allowed into mathematics, it turned out that they explained a bunch of natural phenomena through entertaining the square root of a negative number. right? And
Mhm.
so what's going on there?
Yeah.
I
And
don't
it
know.
actually reminds me of like it's almost like what we were talking about before is like articulating an intuition. So sort of like respecting the nonlinear thing we were talking about, like the mathematics or like the supernatural stuff. Like because David, you were even saying before that in the Western canon, the sort of embodied stuff we don't really respect. And I agree with that, especially like at universities and schools. But like when you get to the highest level, like I don't know about you guys, but like when you talk to like the best scientists, a lot of it is like creativity and art. And you're just sort of
Yeah.
like, oh, that person is just really good at this thing. And I don't know how they do it. And they might not even know how they do it. So I think like anybody who's at like a really high level, or when you get to that really high level, um, that sort of assignment of like this is art or creativity or imagination or aesthetic. Like for me at least, whenever I hear anybody who's really, really good at what they do, a lot of it isn't explicit, and I think it just comes back to like it's articulating or it's a placeholder for this intuition.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, a lot of it is you've absorbed a lot of good ideas and you're good at distinguishing the good ideas from the bad ideas, and you've just stored them in your unconscious and have made them available whenever they're needed. And when you talk to like a smart person and they can just pull the perfect concept at the perfect time, they've just like that feels like a kind of art form,
Yeah.
analogous to, someone riffing on the guitar
Yeah,
or
Yeah.
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah, like I don't know how you felt, Clark, but like when I would sit in at the Center for Evolutionary Psychology and listen to like John Orlita, it
yeah.
was sort of as a young student of theirs. And David, you might have had a similar experience at UCLA where it's very much that experience, right? Like where it's sort of, oh, this is an apprenticeship in a way. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think something to think about for our field is, um, you know, so a topic that I wanted to possibly return to, if it's okay, or just to
Yeah.
insert as something to,
Yeah,
is the importance of diversity of ideas, diversity of
yeah,
people, diversity of ideas, in
yeah.
science, which, is a contested thing right now. But um, one of the reasons that we can, once you become steeped in a tradition of thinking about the mind and the body, I mean, the number of sources that we have to think about these things and the number of concepts that we have to draw on is incredible. I mean, when you think about um, all the things that we've been talking about, when you're in evolutionary science, we also have certain kinds of concepts that are incredibly generative, like mismatch. I mean, I think people can be wrong about mismatch and it's overused perhaps, but that is something that comes out of evolutionary thinking that is, I mean, once you know what that is, it's
Yeah.
incredibly generative, right?
Yeah,
And there's different kinds of mismatch, right? I mean, there's sort of deep time evolutionary mismatch, there's historical mismatch, there's even personal experience mismatch. I mean, I'm not a digital native. I grew up
yeah,
before I didn't have an email account or whatever, and so I have a mismatch in
yeah,
my own life with the way things are right. What a useful concept. I mean, it comes from dynamical systems and it interfaces with these other areas. And that's just to take one. I mean, there's just
yeah,
so many. And, when one tradition that I've been looking at quite a bit lately is, the phenomenology tradition, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, people like that, where, I mean, if you look at that, they have really, really interesting views about sort of how we engage with the world at a kind of non-representational level through direct interaction with other people. So there's a bunch of words and concepts from that field that are useful. If we were to expand this out to the rest of the kind of systems in the world that exist for thinking about minds and bodies and all the other kinds of things we want to talk about, I mean, it can only benefit evolutionary science. Some of the things may end up being wrong, or we may have to modify them in some way. But one of my things right now is to make a pitch that our field, because we are telling the story of all humans. Um, when you actually look at the way the field is composed, it is not being told by all humans or by a representative sample of all humans. There's various reasons why that might or might not be. I have my own feelings about it, but I do think that one of the things is that we're not that there's something about evolutionary science where it is not creating a kind of welcoming space for a lot of people to come in from other cultural traditions and other kinds of backgrounds to a certain extent. I don't want to go too far in that direction, but I think that it will benefit us as a field to think about like how do we bring in people from these other traditions? Because when you start to look, I mean, one thing I have to say from working in South American indigenous communities, like the idea of evolution is not a problem for most people. In fact, the idea that humans are one species among many, and that we're related to everything else through kinship, essentially, is a deeply reverberating idea in indigenous communities. In fact, it's makes way more sense to people growing up in those traditions than it does to people raised, for example, in a religious European tradition where humans are special and separate. So there's all kinds of reasons why bringing in people from outside of the traditions that we are normally in are going to help evolutionary science and give us this sort of broader palette of ideas we can think of. So that, when I think about the sort of how much we have internalized and embedded in our own thoughts, these ways of thinking that are really generative, I think we can expand it even further.
Is the argument that evolutionary behavioral sciences is still born out of behavioral sciences, psychology, and it's more maybe cross-cultural, just to sort of be reductive about it, but it's more cross-cultural than a lot of that stuff.
Yes.
But we can still do better in the sense of because there's a theory, because we already are coming from things in a very different way, we have a way to look around at even more stuff and say, look, here's the sense in which this is a helpful tool. We can understand why this makes sense. Whereas traditional scientists might just poo poo this idea or think it's unsophisticated, like in the example of magic,
Right.
where you're just sort of like, physicists are like, that's garbage, or like, just to be super um, unfair, but like cognitive scientists might be, that's just garbage, right? Like
Mhm.
it's not
Yeah.
real. We don't study that. We're sophisticated psychologists and we study deduction. We have this unique thing of we have the secret tool to understand the way in which everything can be science, and we're not doing as good of a job, or we could always do a better job of just going out and going to all the places where people have sort of been not taken seriously and take them seriously.
Mhm. Definitely. The other thing that I would say, just to kind of make what I'm saying even a little bit more explicit, is I think that evolutionary science has heeded. Most evolutionary scientists have read the weird paper, the idea from Henrik et al. That we're our research participants are coming from a unrepresentative sample of humanity. Like, I don't think we've actually fixed that problem, but most evolutionary scientists are aware of it and I think would agree. Um, but that is still seeing that is still making essentially an argument that we need to get data from other places. And I think there's an additional step, which is that the people doing the science have to be from all walks of life, right? And that in so in the area that I work in, morality, it's become increasingly obvious to me, that we have these theories of what morality is or might be that might be a subset of possible theories, and when we develop these kind of methods for testing them, which I've done myself as well, we develop these vignettes and that have to do with like the importance of intentions and so on, where we go out to these other societies. It might be going too far to say that we're projecting something onto these places, but we're certainly
Yeah.
choosing a space in the moral landscape to look at very carefully, because the theories that come from Europe, for example, tell us this is these are the important distinctions
Right.
to make. And if we had people, from other traditions to tell us, well, morality is about more than this, or there might be other kinds of things here, I think we would make real progress in that area.
Yeah. No,
I mean, we are
from my
making
point of,
some progress, but I think we'll make more.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I mean, the literature in moral psychology is absolutely saturated with Western philosophy, historical traditions, Kant and the categorical imperative, utilitarianism and deontology,
Yeah,
mens rea, and the whole legal system and legal framework for thinking about crime and punishment.
that's
Like
right.
all these ideas are absolutely, at the theoretical center of our thinking in terms of moral cognition, moral psychology. That isn't to say that's bad. I mean, you got to start somewhere.
Right.
But this is very different from the way that moral practices are conducted in different cultures, and the idea that these distinctions and these categories and these concepts are shaping our theorizing about morality, I think it is bound to have a distortive influence on what our picture of morality is looking like.
Yep. Yep. And I think it goes back to, I mean, I think some of the problems, I agree with everything that you just said there. I mean, you got to start somewhere. It's not like the
Yeah,
work that exists is bad
yeah,
necessarily. Um, but it's the kind of like, I mean, one problem that can arise from this is that you're looking for the keys under the street light because the light is
yeah,
better there kind of
yeah,
problem.
sure.
And then the other one I think which comes up with morality is the kind of flavor thing that we're talking about,
Yeah.
where so my view of the problem with the sort of intentions versus outcomes debate, which has really occupied most of
And so, what is that? Just to familiarize people who don't know what that is.
it's there's an idea that I mean you mentioned mens rea. I mean there's an
Mhm.
idea that comes from certain kinds of Western philosophy, deontology, and other kind of approaches that say it's the intention behind an act or the reason behind an act that makes it morally good or bad.
Mhm.
And that is the basis for most Western law, at least criminal law, right?
Mhm.
But the and then there's been a debate partly partly because of a paper that I was part of in 2016 in PNAS where we did a bunch of vignettes around the world and showed that there seems to be blaming people for intent versus outcome. If you create scenarios where you can sort of play those off against each other, it's not always the case that intent wins over outcome. The fact that you caused harm, even if you didn't intend it, can sometimes be very morally blameworthy. And then
Mhm.
there's a debate about why that is. I've
Yeah.
participated in that debate. I think it's an important one. But what has been missing and is starting to change a little bit in the moral literature is that, we're people, that perspective, which is very much act focused, it's focused on acts. Um, if you look more at, I mean, if you listen to what people say in communities around the world and you look more at the literature on morality from cultural anthropology, relationships are extremely important. Um, Everything is embedded in within relationships, and the same act matters differently depending on what your relationship is. It's not that that's
Mhm.
something that evolutionary psychologists don't know, or cognitive scientists who are designing, philosophers who are designing these vignettes, but it hasn't been foregrounded in this literature at all.
Right.
And there's also this huge, if you look at traditions, even Aristotle and others, virtue ethics, right? Have to do with um, there's many moralized things that aren't even acts.
Yeah.
That I mean, ways of being that are virtuous or vicious, that don't involve causing harm to another person, for example. And
Even
and that
ways of thinking.
and
Yeah.
ways of thinking, yes, wait, wait,
Yeah.
wait, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Those are kind of missing. And so, I think we're off to a good start, but I think one of the arguments I would make is that if we had brought in some of these perspectives from outside of the kind of theoretical traditions that we've had, we would be making progress faster because there would be people from other traditions saying, wait a second, yeah, okay, of course we care what the intention is, but really it's about who is this and why are they, who is person A and who is person B? And it's funny, I realized that when I was doing those initial studies, that's the number one thing that people would ask you when you're running
That's
these things in
interesting.
the field. They're like, who is this guy? And I'm like, well, it's just a guy. It's just a guy.
Doesn't matter. It doesn't
Right. And,
matter.
and, and
Yeah.
right. And then as psychologists, we're kind of trained. We want to remove
Yeah.
everything from
Mhm.
the framing that's considered a virtue, right? In running the experiment. It's
Mhm.
just a random guy. And they're like, well, if it's just a random guy, I can't tell you whether it's bad or good.
Yeah.
People would say that. And it's like, oh yeah, duh, right? I mean, that is a reasonable
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
No, it's a fascinating response that we come up with these questionnaires in our weird societies, and then we bring them to a person living in a very different culture, and they ask us these flabbergasting questions like, "Who is this guy?" And if I don't know him, then it doesn't matter. Like, I don't know. It's just such a shocking thing to be confronted with,
yeah,
and such a profound thing. You know, like obviously that should be of even from an evolutionary perspective, this should have occurred to us that like
yes,
obviously if the person is a member of your family versus a member of your group or a friend or an ally or an enemy that like or a stranger that this should be deeply, I mean, it's evolutionarily in terms of the fitness implications of the act incredibly relevant. And
hmm
this and the fact that this didn't occur to us, in crafting our theorizing and our questionnaires, tells us that we are missing something. We're missing a perspective.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah,
um,
I think that's right. And I mean, just one thing that I wanted to circle back to, David, that you said something about legal systems.
yeah.
The more that I've done these studies, I think, and I'm working in the sort of field of experimental philosophy where you take vignettes and it has this wonderful feature where you can just vary like a tiny thing in the vignette, and then you're sort of doing a controlled comparison of, well, and you can even do that for like, I changed the identity of the person. It's a brother versus a stranger or whatever.
Yeah.
And we are doing some of that. We've been doing that in Geography of Philosophy project.
Hmm.
But I will say that I've also started to really entertain the possibility that, our legal systems are basically built for impersonality,
Yeah.
if that's a word, and impartiality, right? Obviously, they're
Hmm.
supposed to be impartial, but also the jury-based legal system in the US and other places is about strangers judging strangers. That's
Yeah.
the entire point of it, right? You actually want the people to be strangers who are making the judgment. And that is, we have this value system where that's supposed to lead to impartiality. And in order to do that, then we have developed this apparatus where evidence has to be presented in a very strange way. You have to exclude things that are obvious about the person that would be relevant to almost anybody,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I understand why that is. We can understand why that is, right? A lawyer can
Yeah.
say, well, we have to exclude this because it's not relevant to this case. This is a bad person, but we're going to leave all of that out
Yeah.
because it's not relevant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many of these procedures that we have, my sense is that, first of all, those are kind of unusual for moral
Hmm.
systems. And we definitely don't want to conflate morality and the law as identical, but the law is this kind of way of adjudicating moral issues, which has this strange, strange property. And so when you make vignettes where you say, "Oh, it's just a guy," and he punched another guy in the face or whatever, you can give that to a bunch of Americans or Europeans or people trained or educated in that system, and they'll
Yeah.
say, "Okay, I see what you mean. I'm extracting out everything except that the act was intentional, and then I'm going to say that's 1 point worse on a Likert scale than the other one," right? People can
Yeah.
do that, but in real life, it's this person perception gestalt. Like you know, you have
Yeah.
all of this information, and it's part of the judgment. And people that study like legal cognition, I think there's a tendency to say that's irrational or bad to include all that information, but in fact that might be the way it's done, right? So that and it leads to biases. It leads to like in-group, out-group biases and things like that, perhaps. But it's also the functional way that, it makes sense to say, I forgive you for this, or no, this is unforgivable.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth thinking about that when we design these studies, because many of them are kind of really based in this legalistic, hyper-rationalistic kind of framework for judging others. And I think that some of the weird findings that we get when we bring some of these vignettes to other places might come from that people are just like struggling with um, how to figure these things out, including, one of the biggest things that we see in some of the studies I've done is that the effect sizes of the manipulations are just much smaller in other places than they are. And So the effect size of like intentional versus accidental can be much smaller in other places sometimes than it is when you do it with like a college sample or a prolific sample. And you know, I think sometimes that's been taken as an actual meaningful data point that these other participants don't care about intentions as much. But what I'm trying to say is, well, you just these manipulations that are supposed to be highly salient to people who are used to thinking in this vignette-based way, they might work there, but for somebody else who's like, I don't, you're telling me this thing, I have no idea what the background is here, so I'm just going to say it's a one on a Likert scale, and you just don't get any difference across the conditions. That's something that can happen.
Yeah. Do you think that's from going to the field? I mean, like one of the themes of this podcast is anthropologist keeps us psychologists honest. Like I don't think that was grammatical, but you get the point. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I mean the field and maybe just outside of academia, interacting with people and trying to get a sense of of what their cognition is like and what they're
Sorry,
in the realm of morality. I mean, I don't
sorry,
know.
there's people outside of the academia. Sorry, what? Where are these people? Who are these people?
Yeah.
Outside the ivory tower. Yeah.
I mean, we all have access to
Yeah.
what's going on in the political world right now, and I mean, so I find it interesting to talk to people who are on different sides of the political spectrum and people who are outside of academia. And it's to figure out like why there's something that I think is bad morally and somebody else thinks it's good morally. And then, why is that? And I think it's actually not so hard to understand once you start looking into it.
Yeah.
But it can be very perplexing to an academic. Like, why? Just for example, like somebody lies all the time. Why are we tolerating this? And it's like, well, I think there are reasons. I think there can be reasons. And I think it can even be understood that there are lies, and people are just like, yeah, that's a lie, but I'm still on the
Yeah.
side of this particular agenda.
Yeah, I mean, to bring it back to this social embeddedness, that it depends so much on who is lying and why
Yeah,
they're lying
Yeah.
and what their relationship is to you
that's right.
socially. I was just reading a really interesting book called Legal Systems, very different from our own, and there was a chapter on Romani legal systems and Romani morality. And what's interesting about the Romani is that they constantly lie to everyone who is outside of the Romani, such that they often give fake names to people who are interviewing them, researchers even,
Mhm.
and census takers in the countries they're living in. And because they have this cultural custom where they always lie to anyone who is not one of them, it becomes very hard to even know how many Romani are living in a particular area
Mm.
because people are giving, the same names or they're not revealing personal information. It makes it very difficult for the census takers. And so to them, it's like it's totally okay to just lie to anyone and just not give them any true information if they're not part of your group. And perhaps it's born of centuries of oppression and mistrust toward outsiders, that if you give outsiders true information, it could be a threat to the group. And that's the way it is. And for
Right.
them, like it could be an ethical thing. Like if you tell the truth to someone who's not a part of your group, that could be immoral,
Mhm.
right?
Sure.
Because you're giving away information that could be a threat to members of the group. And so, and there, it's another example of the profound importance of who is the person, what their relationship is to you, what the full context is. It's not just lying bad. It's what's all the contextual information surrounding that. Um,
Yeah.
you know,
Super interesting.
you know. Um,
Yeah.
I want to get. I'm just personally curious. What is your take on the intention outcome debate and its universality? Whether this distinction between I intentionally wronged someone versus I accidentally wronged someone is that distinction culturally universal or something close to it? If I could just get a soundbite of what is your summary, because you're an expert in this area, and I'm just curious about what you've synthesized from your work on it.
Yeah, I would say so. Um, I think that the distinction between intentional and various forms of accidental is universal. I think everyone can understand that. I think how it's used to assign blame is complex and varies across situations within groups and across groups. I mean, I have I'm skeptical of what I've called the cultural main effects model of intentionality. So I have a paper on this with Rebecca Sachs, where we basically are arguing, there are lots of differences, but the idea that there's just some dimension where some societies are more intention oriented and others aren't, is something to be kind of skeptical of.
Hmm.
And that the methods that we have um, can't even really tell you that because there's no principled way to generate like a range of scenarios that completely flatly surveys the morality space to show that, say, Americans care more about intentions in assigning moral blame than, someone in Fiji, for example, where,
Hmm.
there's this claim that intentions matter less. I'm not saying that there's not discourse in Fiji about how you can't know other people's minds and so on. There's this idea of mental opacity I think is very real and comes out through ethnographic work. But whether it's easily mapped onto sort of moral judgments about the role of intentions and culpability is harder to say. The other thing I'll mention is, and I don't want to spoil this too much because I have unpublished data from geography of philosophy, but you know, we so some of the stuff I've been talking about relationships, we've been starting to manipulate those and see how those affect judgments. But the other kind of category um, that I think is important to keep in mind is there's a lot of mistakes or accidents that are not good. And we see those in the news a lot. And there is also, we have evidence from a pretty interesting cross-cultural study that everywhere that we looked, people do make fine-grained distinctions between different kinds of accident that are in the law. So the classic one is between recklessness and negligence. And
Mhm.
we use vignettes to show that that's a very fine-grained distinction. And those words don't exist in every language.
Mhm.
But you can create scenarios where an actor does something knowing that harm might happen and they don't care, which is recklessness, right? Or they do something where they just don't know what might happen, but they do it anyway, which is negligent. I mean, those are not the legally
Hmm.
technical terms, right? But they're,
Right.
recklessness is a little bit worse than negligence in the law, right?
Hmm.
Because you know that there might be some bad effects of what you're doing, but you're speeding anyway, or you're driving drunk or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, Everywhere that we looked, we found that people make those distinctions, and those are not intentional harm. So,
Hmm.
and the reason that that matters is that um, if you think so, there's some kind of views of the sort of society, that societies that don't pay attention to intentions are just outcome oriented, and that they're kind of mind blind in their moral judgment. I mean, this study shows that they're not actually, even for cases of accidental harm, you're calculating, or you can be calculating what the other person knew. And this is a huge domain of morality I think is important that overlaps with epistemology. There's virtues and vices associated with knowledge,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, a theme that you see across cultures is if you're taking action, and the lying about the future thing has something to do with this too. If you're taking action um, that has some kind of moral or ethical significance, your state of knowledge matters. And there's many cases where I think it's almost universal. People would say you shouldn't do that if you don't know certain things,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so having the relevant knowledge is actually a prerequisite to acting as a ethically virtuous individual, right? I mean, and we would agree, nobody should agree to do brain surgery unless unless you know what you're doing. I mean, the
Yeah.
excuse, well, I'm sorry I messed up your frontal lobe. It was a mistake, doesn't really work well if you're not a trained surgeon, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't blow up the building if you don't know if somebody's in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, I think not only do intentions matter, but that actually people make really fine-grained distinctions about the reasons for action. And we do know that there are domains, and this is also true in Western law, where there are things like strict liability domains where you basically are going to have to pay a penalty regardless of what you did or didn't know.
Mhm.
I think those are special cases, and they exist in all cultures, but it makes sense to have those in certain kinds of situations where um, it's just like a deterrent.
Yeah.
It's like basically. Um, but I think again that and Rebecca and I argue this in that paper about mind-blind morality, that doesn't mean that people aren't making more fine-grained moral judgments underneath that. They can be like, yes, you have to pay this fine or you have to go to jail for this period of time because you did it. But they still may be, if they know details of the situation, they still may be like, man, it's really unfortunate that we had to send so and so to jail, or it's really unfortunate that he had to pay this money. But that's the way it is because we have that rule, and it's there for some kind of reason.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that's how I would sort of see the landscape.
Yeah, so it's not this idea that certain cultures, the mental states don't matter in moral cognition. That's actually couldn't be further from the truth because when you actually look into it, it seems like mental states matter so much that they're, teasing them apart with a scalpel. That
That's
they're
right.
they're zooming in on these really nuanced distinctions about
Yeah.
mental states in terms of
Yes.
their moral evaluations. I wonder if the cultural variation that we do see is a byproduct of variation in trust and who the agent committing the act is. Or so there's some interesting modeling work by Julien Lapenie, and he argues that these kind of rigid, all or nothing moral systems where there are no excuses, your mental states don't matter, that these tend to evolve naturally in low trust settings, where
Mhm.
sometimes the only information you get about another person's mental states depends on testimony. And if you don't trust that testimony, and people
Yeah.
are constantly trying to make excuses and wiggle out of, paying the price for their transgressions, then you get these kind of rigid rules where there are no excuses. If the outcome is this, then you're punished, and we just can't let all this wiggle room enter into this because we don't trust the excuses that people are going to make. And in those kinds of settings, you get more rigid moral rules. So it may be that when you don't trust the sources of information that reveal mental states, then you get this kind of seeming ignorant or seeming downplaying of the importance of mental states just because the information about them is less reliable and less trustworthy. It's not that the intentions don't matter or that they don't factor into morality. It's that we're actually very sensitive about the reliability of the information sources that are telling us about mental states. I
Yeah.
don't know, do you think that's a plausible way of understanding this?
I do. I mean, it also fits with the literature on mental opacity, for example, in the Pacific, in places like New Guinea and Fiji and places like this, it's a kind of explicitly held value, or it's
Mm.
something that's taught by parents to kids where they say, well, you can't really trust what people say.
Yeah,
And so, just because somebody tells you that this is what they think or know or do, or why they did something, you can't really trust it, which is pretty reasonable advice.
yeah,
Um, and as we know, mental opacity is actually the norm. I mean, you can't actually see into somebody else's mind. So all
yeah,
those kinds of beliefs are sensible. That it would correlate with trust, yeah, makes sense. I mean, I would want to know, yeah, a little bit more about like why there are some societies that are high trust or low trust.
yeah, for sure.
But I think that also in the case of the mental opacity things, with testimony, I mean, there is some of the anthropology literature does say that it's these sort of values about not they're oriented towards testimony cases, like you're saying, like you can't trust what people say. But obviously we have many other ways to make
Yeah,
inferences about people's thoughts. And so
yeah,
one of the things that would be useful in some of those places would be to have you know to look at how at people's just person perception, whether that makes a difference when they judge, whether something somebody did was bad or good or on purpose or not. Because
yeah,
sometimes you can just tell from other cues
for
besides what
sure.
somebody is saying.
Yeah, I like
Yeah,
that example, David. But I also think that there's probably lots of things. Because, like, for example, if you're in a community with people and you're constantly interacting with them, like, let's say I'm in a hunting relationship with somebody and somebody doesn't mean to be loud in the forest, but they're scaring all the game away, you know, if we're just passing on the street for 5 seconds in a modern large scale society and they just happen to be loud, and I'm like, well, they didn't mean to be, I'll forgive them. But I'm stuck with this guy. He's loud. And every time I go out with him, he's scaring away all the food from me and my family. yeah, I don't care if he means it or not. Like I'm dealing with the consequences. I'm stuck with him. So that's like another example where
Yeah.
it's just like the nature of the local ecology is that whether he intends it or not, in one case, I'm minimally affected in the large scale environment. In the small scale environment, I am just I'm really negatively impacted. And so yeah, I'm not going to care if he intends it or not because even if it's unintended, it still sucks for me.
Yeah, I
Interesting.
mean, I think we're faced these days. I don't know about you all, but like, maybe it's always been this way, but like, there's so many changing norms in the world. Can you have a FaceTime call, you know, with volume loud on the plane next
Yeah.
to somebody or
No,
whatever?
you're fine. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's going on there, but there's a lot of cases where I'm like
Yeah.
making judgments about what other people are doing, and then you both have to fold in like the effect that they're having on you, what they know and intend, and then we all have some personal sort of set points of like how relativistic are we going to be? Like I'm just being like,
Yeah.
well, okay, that's that person's
Yeah.
that's how that person grew up, or and so I let it ride or
Yeah.
whatever. But we're faced with those kinds of nuanced situations all the time.
Yeah. One theme I feel like of this whole conversation as we're sort of wrapping up because we're getting
Yeah.
in is that the theme has been like respect stuff that hasn't been respected um, adequately. Would you agree with that? That that's sort of maybe a North Star for the evolutionary behavioral sciences is to sort of double check that we're respecting things adequately.
Respecting.
Well, like, I mean, so an evolutionary psychologist who's like, oh, yeah, no, magic, that's dumb. Or like free will, that's dumb. Or, cultural anthropology, that's dumb. Or cultural theory, that's
Yeah.
dumb. And we're hard-nosed scientists, and so screw them, and we're better because we take a gene's eye view. That's one
Right.
way to sort of just be like, we feel good about ourselves, but we're insulating
Yes.
ourselves versus like, yeah, the cultural anthropologists, whether they're spitting at us or not, we go in and we're like, this is a evolved organism. There's going to be some sense in which what they're saying is deeply insightful if we'll just shut up and listen to it. And that's a different way to approach the
Yeah.
sociology of science, sort of. Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah, I definitely think that it's important to take seriously when people, whether they're other theorists or other people that we're interacting with as research collaborators or interlocutors or participants in our studies, and when there's things that people take seriously, we should take them seriously as well. And there's various ways, of dealing with that, or theorizing it or thinking about it. Um, but so, and people kick around this idea of humility, scientific humility. I mean, I do think that that's an important trait, but it's also kind of, I guess I would make, I mean, humility in some ways you could say, well, it's just like, I don't know, maybe I don't know, and that's fine. But I think we can go beyond that to be more, I would call for reflexivity. Like, look at what you're doing, look at, um, take seriously different possibilities. I mean, for example, I think a lot of evolutionary science is essentially confirmatory. I mean, people think of an idea and they're like, I'm going to demonstrate the plausibility of this idea, which I think we can all agree that's a good first step, right? Um, but you got to go past that at a certain point. And when you look at the amount of stuff that's out there, like genuine hypothesis testing is actually kind of rare, I think. Putting one's own ideas in jeopardy or putting it up against a plausible alternative. So that's the kind of thing where I think respect for other possibilities is something we should have. I mean, I just to take one example, the ideas that Tubi and Cosmides, my own PhD advisors, you know, in the adapted mind in 1992, they coined this idea of the standard social science model, which is basically kind of a blank slate view of the mind. And I think that that's an, I mean, I understand why they did that. And I think that was an important move. I think that it has caused some damage, however, because by being able to put everything that's an alternative to your theory, whatever it might be as an evolutionary scientist, into that folder, it means that no other kinds of theories are ever given a fair shake, or it's just very rare for people to give other kinds of theories a fair shake when testing an evolutionary hypothesis. And so, I think that's something where we could do better. I also think um, that the promise of adaptationism hasn't really been as fulfilled as we might have wanted it to be. That one of the things that I was taught, and you were both taught as being part of the community of evolutionary psychologists, is that the standards of evidence for adaptations, should be high. The bar should be high. And
Mm.
when you actually look, I mean, I don't want to harsh on our own field too much, but I mean, if you look out there, I feel like the bar is not high in a lot of the studies that are out there for really confirming that we've discovered a biologically evolved adaptation in the mind. Um, there's not as many cases that seem satisfying as you might think, and there's a lot of cases where people say that they've discovered an adaptation, but the evidence that they have is pretty thin. So, I mean, that would be another case where I think whatever the word is, humility, respect for other alternatives, but also just active reflexivity of trying to do better, I think would help us a lot. Um,
Yeah, cool. Yeah, there's
realize
a
the
ton.
promise of evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, Tom Scott Phillips has a paper about, I think it won the Don Simon's award, was about arguing that something wasn't adaptation that people had been talking about was, and he sort of brought up this idea that adaptation is an onerous concept, as George Williams put it, that
Right.
we should reserve it. Yeah, I mean, I do want to appreciate, and David and I do this, and Clark, you do too, that like you have to speculate about adaptations to look
Yeah.
for evidence to test whether there is one. But
Yep.
that's a separate enterprise than assuming away that it is an adaptation and not being rigorous even down the road. That those are two different things. Speculating or proposing one versus testing it or assuming it. These are different
Hmm.
phases of science, and I think we kind of smush them together.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a bunch of kinds of things that we have. I mean, two of the major kinds of evidence that you see in evolutionary science papers are, correlations. So something, how you answer on some scale is correlated with how you behave in some other context, because adaptation is often the explanation that's given, which could be, but right? I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that you need to push harder than that. And, the other kind of thing is kind of universal patterns, which are of course really useful to
Yeah.
know but I mean, if 80% of people answer a question the same way around the world, it's a long way from that to adaptation. Um, Obviously you need to have it coupled with a good theory and all that stuff, but and that matters. But the standards of evidence also, often there's a big gap between um, the evidence and the claim that there's an adaptation underlying the universality. And I just say that because I think, this is something that this is the kind of gold standard of our field. Like you're mentioning George Williams, right? I mean, to discover a correlation is great. That could be a fact that how you answer on a scale is correlated with how close you stand to people in public or something like that. But to go that, to say that there's an evolved adaptation that's responsible for it in a particular mechanistic way is a whole other layer that often we don't go far enough to showing that or to ruling out other alternatives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
agreed. Yeah.
Agreed indeed. All
All right.
right.
Well, we anything we should ask you, Clark, as we wind down here?
No, I mean, I think, did you guys have any other topics you wanted to cover?
Probably a lot, including how does a
Yeah.
double-jawed fish chew its food? But maybe that's
Mm.
for a
I would
different.
love to have a whole episode about cichlids and their double jaws.
Yeah, 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 Fisher.
Fish are weird.
Fish are
Indeed.
cool.
They are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Clark, but anyway, yeah. So yeah, we'll definitely have you back on. But I really want to say thank you for being on, but also being being in this field. There are so many people that I talk to outside of evolutionary psychology are like, oh, I hate evolutionary psychologists, except for Clark Barrett. Um, and he's okay. And actually, I mean, I think that's gotten less and less, but in part because also heard many evolutionary scientists, as I've grown up in this field, also being like, I'm going to do the Clark way and just be nice. Like you win more flies with honey. And so I think you've sort of made the evolutionary social sciences a kinder, more welcoming place. And I think that, as you say, only helps in the sense of getting more people doing it. Because ultimately, that's the point, right? Is like as David and I have said, and that everyone has said, the goal of all this is to make evolutionary psychology disappear because it's just part of the water that all the scientific fish, to bring it back, fish swim in, and we can do that by just being nice about it.
Hmm. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. I mean, I think that, also a another way to think about that, in addition to just being nice, which I think is a virtue, is that, a lot of things that evolutionary psychologists think of as sort of zero-sum games or trade-offs really are not. And
Mhm.
so, you know, as I said, this kind of conflict that's happened between evolutionary science and other branches of science like certain kinds of anthropology and so on. Um, Sometimes both sides of that see it as that there's a conflict there, but my experience is that that's not true, or it doesn't need to be true.
Yeah.
Uh, and um, you can have an evolutionary science that takes cultural phenomena and human diversity incredibly seriously, and everyone kind of should agree that it should in order to be a proper evolutionary science. Um, and so there's no loss to us from doing that. There's only gain. And I do feel from having been involved with HBES and other kinds of things in our community, I do notice that sometimes there are people who feel not welcome in our community for various reasons because of the theoretical persuasion that they have, or whatever it might be. Not all of that is our fault, but it's worth reflecting on what parts of it, in what ways can we make evolutionary science a more welcoming community, including, for people who might not be sure or not know very much about evolutionary theory, but they are interested in human behavior, and they might bring a lot to the table. I think there are things that we can do to make people feel welcome, who have just a curiosity about these things. And so part of that involves being nice, and part of that also involves, as you said before, kind of respect for people,
Yeah.
and why that we all have reasons for getting involved in academia. We all want to know something about ourselves or the mind or the world or whatever. And I think if we expand the tent of evolutionary psychology, we can bring in a lot of people who are fascinated
Yeah.
by all the things that we're talking about.
Right. To view the modus operandi of our discipline not as a conquering mindset where we're right and they're wrong and we're going to conquer them and bend them to our will, but more of an absorbing mindset where, you know, we're taking the insights that they have and absorbing it and into our framework, and welcoming people. Um,
Yeah.
I think is a better way to think of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think being nice, like I want to really be clear, like nice is not like wishy-washy, like, oh,
Right.
there's some crappy theory and we're like, well, maybe that's right too. It's actually the opposite of that, which is sort of to say that crappy theory, here's the smart translation of that. So it's
Yeah.
actually more rigorous to absorb than to just sort
Yes.
of do the mediocre thing of like, well, that's a crap theory, I'm going to ignore it. You're like, okay, what is the sense that makes?
Yeah.
How is it
Yeah.
right is a
Yeah.
harder question than saying it's not right, right? That's a
Yeah.
different, and
Mhm.
that's the argument, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. No, there's this idea of, steel manning, which is the opposite of
Yeah.
straw manning. We're like making the best possible case for the
Yes.
for the view that you disagree with. And, bringing it back to the standard social science model, it was a helpful distinction at the time.
Mhm.
but there could have been a more steel-manned position of what the standard social science model is. And I think we should constantly be striving to frame alternative theories, alternative models in the best possible light, and find out what insight there is there,
Yeah.
or at least making it as rigorous as possible to combat the ever tempting presence of straw manning in our thinking. You know, uh, so
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, it's yeah, that distinction that was made, as you said, might have been useful at the time. I think, there's also a kind of residual feeling of combativeness in evolutionary
yeah,
psychology because when it originated, it was, people
it
felt that
was
they were
combated.
the underdogs. Yes.
Yeah, yes,
But I think eventually, whether now is the time, but I think now is the time, it will benefit us and everyone else to move past that kind of mindset and also to realize that, if people come to the table with an idea or a phenomenon or a theory or whatever, if it's not evolutionary, quote unquote, in the sense that we would see it that way right off the bat, um, that's not a reason to dismiss it. That's not a reason
no,
to it should be allowed into the discussion and
yeah, and if possible, translated into our
right.
way of thinking, because a lot of non-evolutionary theories often can be translated into an evolutionary framework quite fruitfully.
Yeah.
The theoretician who developed the idea might not have been thinking about evolution, but you can integrate it with existing ideas and buttress it with existing ideas that can often be very, very helpful. Um,
Yep.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So
We should have called it the podcast.
May- maybe that'll be our last episode in 30 years. We'll change the name to the podcast and our work will be done.
There we go.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Clark, this is great. Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll have you on again. And
Thanks.
yeah,
Thanks for the conversation. And thank you both for doing this podcast. I've been listening to some of them and I've been really enjoying them. And it's a great format for kind of extended discussions and hearing things from colleagues as well as, new voices that I haven't heard before in this space. And I know it's some work for you guys to do as well. So I appreciate that.
yeah, awesome. Thanks,
Yeah,
thanks so much. Yeah, and it's awesome to just get a chance to talk to you. Like yeah, I see
yeah.
you a bunch, but I rarely get a chance to talk to you this in depth. So it's a treat for both David and I assume David for you too, but.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Clark, have a good one.
Yep.
Thanks. Take
Okay.
care.
Well, you're still listening, which means you like what you're hearing. So what can you do to support us, Dave?
You can go out and buy Clark Barrett's Shape of Thought book.
Wonderful book, one of my favorites.
Yeah,
Uh, but
banger.
banger. What else? What else can people do who are listening?
Maybe we should have an Evolutionary Psychology the podcast book.
Oh, that would be interesting. Maybe like transcripts of our some of our best interviews.
Yeah, maybe we can have a coffee table book of some kind.
Maybe just pictures of us just talking to people.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I haven't really thought too much about it. Obviously, it's very apparent, but we can workshop that. Let's circle back to that, as they say in bureaucratic ease. But anyway, we have a job now, which is to end the episode, and the way to end the episode is to remind you to please support the podcast by.
uh, Visiting our Patreon page and maybe pitching in some money so that we can pay for a huge print run of Evolutionary Psychology, the book. Sorry, Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, the book.
Oh, nice. And then
Maybe
the
maybe
coffee
we should
table
make
book.
coffee table book. Maybe we should make Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, the book, the movie, the
Oh,
video game. We should just go through the whole
nice.
journey.
Nice. And the last word is the thing it is. So it would be a video game about a movie, about a book, about a podcast.
That's right. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, that was straightforward.
I think it's going to be a real moneymaker.
Yeah, let's
Anyway, if you
greenlight
want to
this.
make that happen, give us some money on Patreon. Otherwise, leave us a kind review, send us an email, say something nice about us on social media. Your support keeps us going, so please be generous with it.
And have a good week, and we'll see you next week. See you next week,
Yep.
David.